Facebook group. Please sign up here. You can get on the email list as well, and I give directions on how to get there and whatnot. So please come up and sign up for that if you're interested in that. First, I want to thank my co-researchers. This is Dr. Charles Grove, who some of you might have heard of over at Harvard UCLA. He's done a lot of research with ayahuasca, psilocybin, MDMA. When I first heard about this kind of research being allowed again in this country, it was because I got an email showing some of his results using psilocybin in cancer patients dealing with existential anxiety, which I thought was fascinating. And I contacted him, and that's how I got involved with this kind of research. I'll talk a little bit more about his research a little bit later. Also, Dennis McKenna, who some of you might have heard of his older brother, Terrence McKenna, is a little more well known, but Dennis is over at Minnesota. And if you can't read that, the quote says, "No theory of neuroscience and how the brain is related to consciousness will ever be complete if it doesn't take psychedelic phenomena into account." And this is his older brother, who died a while back, Terrence McKenna, who's, even though he's passed away, he seems like he's more alive now than ever on the internet. I mean, Facebook groups and everything, his words are just having a phenomenal impact in terms of psychedelics and spreading the word on that. And if you can't read that, it says, "If the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness don't include the right to experiment with your own consciousness, then the Declaration of Independence isn't worth the hemp it was written on." And finally, I want to thank, this is Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who, if you don't know the story, they were kicked out of Harvard Medical Center for their use, experimentation with LSD, with students and so forth. Took very divergent paths. I'm not going to go too much into that, but fascinating story if you're interested in looking more into that. But I just want to give a shout out to that as well. So just a brief word about history. Back in starting as early as the 50s and even before, there was a lot of interesting research going on, 50s, 60s, 70s, into LSD, psilocybin, a lot of these different compounds with pretty remarkable results in terms of dealing with end-stage cancer patients, dealing with their anxiety, alcoholism, addictions, depression, and so forth. Pretty remarkable strides being made, and unfortunately that was all put to a halt around 1970 during the Nixon administration, when all of these substances were put on Schedule I and made illegal. Illegal to purchase, illegal to study, and so forth. And it wasn't until around 1990 when the door was open again with Rick Strassman started doing work with DMT from 1990 to 95, did some interesting research with that. And that kind of opened the door for all these other compounds to be studied. And it's slowly gaining momentum. So nowadays, you're seeing a lot more of it in the press too. It's getting a lot more attention. I just put Neurons for Nirvana here. There's many different resources to catch. But this is a kind of a nice one to just get some of the history and a broad swath of what's going on with some of these different compounds. So just as a reminder what a Schedule I is, to be on a Schedule I, there has to be a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use and treatment in the US, and lack of accepted safety for use of the drug or substance under medical supervision. And I think as I show you some of the results from these studies, it becomes pretty evident that these do not deserve to be on Schedule I, because some of these, there are potential for abuse, but under the right circumstance and supervision and context, it's very much minimized. There's tons of evidence coming out now showing that there's a lot of medical use potential for these compounds. And in terms of safety, there's varying degrees of dangers, of course, with these, but a lot of these are overhyped in a lot of ways, and I'll show you another slide that shows kind of the relative safety and danger of them. And just an interesting fun fact, heroin and bath salts are also on Schedule I, but alcohol and tobacco are not even scheduled. So just shows kind of the weird logic of this, because alcohol, as you know, is one of the more dangerous substances that people take. This is an interesting graph that was developed by Dr. Nutt in London, and shows the relative harm caused by these different drugs. As you can see, alcohol tops the list, and if you can't read the top there, the dark part of the bar shows harm to others, and the lighter bars show harm to the users of these substances. And so as you can see, it's alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine, tobacco's up there, amphetamine, which kind of makes sense. As you can see down below, mushrooms, which refers to magic mushrooms, or psilocybin, which is a Schedule I substance. It's at the very bottom, LSD, ecstasy, or MDMA. All these are, in terms of relative dangers, they're relatively safe compared to these other compounds. And yet they're still on Schedule I, claiming that they're dangerous, which they are under the wrong circumstances, but under the right circumstances, they are relatively safe compared to these other substances. And Professor Nutt got fired from the government's drug board for publishing these results.
So can I ask you about that chart? It looks like he sort of normalized it somehow to 100. And do you have any idea what anything on that chart means?
There's a great interview that he did recently where he describes all that in detail. I don't want to spend too much time on it now, but we can talk about it later if you want.
It's actually impossible, but
yeah, that's just, and it's not just coming out. I mean, they did put a lot of thought into this, which is really interesting the way they did it. So. All right, I just want to go over the terms of. Most of you are familiar with the term psychedelic and hallucinogen. The new kid on the block is entheogen. Hallucinogen is pertaining to generating hallucinations. Psychedelic means mind manifesting or mind revealing or soul revealing. And entheogen is generating the divine or God within. So you can see it has more spiritual bent to it. So words have a lot of power in the society. So it used to be they were using psychotomimetic, which is mimicking psychosis. So the way these terms are referred to it's pretty important. So you're going to be seeing a lot more the term entheogen, but for the most part, psychedelics is the accepted word by most people. But I just want to point that out in case you see that in the literature. So I just want to go briefly over some of these substances and kind of catch you up on some of the research that's been going on with it. First one is LSD. This is a sheet of blotter with Alice in Wonderland. And back in the 50s, there was a lot of interesting research going on with alcoholism, with psychotherapy, with depression, anxiety, and end-stage cancer, and so forth. A lot of great strides are being made back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now that it's being reopened, they're just taking a look at some of these again in some of the same areas: depression, anxiety, end-stage cancer, addictions. And that's all I want to say about that for now. This is ecstasy or MDMA, which I'm going to show you some slides coming out of some MAPS research. That's pretty fascinating, so I'm not going to say too much about that right now. This is peyote, which I was talking a little bit earlier before this. I couldn't find a lot of research on this. I think this is something that needs a lot more attention in terms of actual funded research. But there is evidence showing that, at least in the Native American church, members of the church who participate in rituals with peyote, there's evidence showing that there are lower levels of alcoholism and substance abuse, let alone the spiritual aspects of the sacrament. This is the iboga plant, which is in Gabon, Africa. And I recently got back from a conference in Mexico where they showed all the evidence for that. And it's pretty amazing stuff. If you're really interested in that, I highly recommend looking into that, because this seems to be one of the really promising treatments for opiate addiction. It's what they do is they take this plant, and it's a long ordeal. It can last 10, 24, up to 36 hours. And the person goes through sort of a life review process. It's a teaching plant, but there's a lot of alkaloids in it, which they're still not sure exactly everything that it does, but it has a pretty good success rate in terms of people being able to come off of these addictions. It's an addiction interrupter, so it doesn't, I mean, the person can go back to the addiction, but there's, with the right, aftercare and training and so forth, it's a very promising plant, and it's also showing a lot of promise with Parkinson's disease and some other different ailments. This is ayahuasca, which I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about later, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but a lot of promise with addictions, depression, a lot of psychiatric ailments. Marijuana, which you're all probably pretty familiar with, but so I'm not going to go into. But they're now looking into research with PTSD, with combat veterans. This is ketamine, which really is kind of a different class of drug and everything, but I thought I'd throw it in here because there's a lot of interesting research going on now with, in terms of treating depression. And it's an analgesic, which has been around since, I believe, the 50s. But now they're showing, I met someone recently who had tried every antidepressant in the book. He'd been depressed ever since he was a child. Nothing worked for him. Psychotherapy, tried everything. So his next steps were to try electroshock and then suicide. That was his course of action. Then he heard about this clinical trial with ketamine. He tried it, and that was what, he's alive now, because he attributes his being alive to that, because he said his depression went away. It was nothing short of miraculous for him. It doesn't work for everyone. It's not a magic bullet. But at least for some people, it seems to be a very promising treatment for that. Unfortunately, it's a shorter acting thing. It's not something that you can take a cure. None of these curative things forever. But with repeated use, it seems to have a lot of promise. And we actually had someone present at LAMPS their research based on this. So if you join the group, you can see we actually taped that one. It's posted there. Fascinating stuff. This is DMT, NN-DMT, which I'm not going to go too much into, but that's one of the ingredients in ayahuasca. It can be taken different ways. Some people smoke it, which is a very shorter acting effect. I'll talk a little about it later. This is Bufo alvarius. This is a toad in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico, which is also, it's the only animal that produces hallucinogens so far that I'm aware of. And it's very different, similar but different from the NN-DMT. Research is kind of newer in this area, but there's a lot of promise in terms of addiction treatment and so forth. In fact, with the ibogaine treatment in Mexico, they started using 5-MeO-DMT after the ibogaine, because ibogaine can be a very trying and it's not an easy thing to go through. It can be very dark for some people, but people tend to feel better after it. So they added this to kind of bring a lighter aspect to it. I mean, you can have dark experiences on this too, but a lot of people have mystical experiences with it, which kind of resparks their life in a way. And very, very interesting substance. And there's also plant sources for that and synthesized versions as well. And this is magic mushrooms. Psilocybin is the active ingredient. And I'm going to go, I'm going to follow up and just give a little bit of information about mushrooms and the MDMA research before I go into ayahuasca, just to kind of follow up on this. So I'd like to just read this quote real quickly. This is Stanislav Grof, a Czech psychiatrist who's really a pioneer in this field in a lot of ways. He was doing a lot of LSD psychotherapy before it became illegal to do so. And he developed holotropic breathing when it became illegal to induce these altered states and work with people. This quote says, the capacity of psychedelic drugs to exteriorize otherwise invisible phenomena and make them the subject of scientific investigation gives these substances a unique potential as research tools for the exploration of the human mind. It does not seem inappropriate or an exaggeration to compare their potential significance for psychiatry to that of the microscope for medicine or the telescope for astronomy. And you hear a lot of people say that when they take some of these substances, they felt it was like 10 years of psychotherapy in one night, or some people say 30 years, and which I think might be an exaggeration, but I think in some circumstances people do. They could be in talk therapy for years and years and not make certain breakthroughs, and when they combine it with some of these substances, they get access to the unconscious that they weren't able to get otherwise. So I think there's a lot to this quote. So real briefly, this is some of the research coming out of MAPS. MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, started by Rick Doblin a while back, and doing wonderful research with MDMA and other substances. I'm going to give the website later if you're interested in following up on this. But this is a study they're doing with combat veterans, and the Mythhoppers, it's a husband and wife team who they've done a lot of this kind of research, have replicated these kind of treatments with not just combat veterans with PTSD, but rape victims, firefighters, policemen, and it seems to have similar effects. So regardless of what the cause of the PTSD is, it seems to have similar effects. But this shows before treatment. So in order to qualify for the study, we had to have PTSD based on assessment devices, which is the CAPS score. So before treatment, 100% had PTSD. They compared it with psychotherapy alone, and psychotherapy alone, afterwards, it looks like about less than 20% were no longer qualified for PTSD diagnosis. But when you combined it with the MDMA, roughly about 84% no longer met that diagnosis. So you don't see effect sizes like this with other things. It's nothing short of miraculous. With 22 vets a day, on average killing themselves, they're really trying to rush this to get this legal in terms of being a treatment. It won't be legal for it to go in a head shop and buy it, but in order to get this kind of psychotherapy, Rick Doblin and MAPS, they're really trying to rush. They're saying maybe around 2020, roughly thereabouts, this is going to be the case, and they're opening up larger clinical trials to follow up on this. This is just another graph showing the average CAPS score, which is what they use to assess this. This is the cutoff line for PTSD diagnosis. So before treatment, the average is way above that. So 2-month follow-up, the average is well below that, around 33, which is below 50. And they wanted to see, well, is this just a flash in the pan? Is this something like, look at a certain remittance and then go back to having PTSD? But they did on average about 4-year follow-up, and sure enough, no, it seemed to stick. And very exciting, very promising research. So now a little bit on psilocybin. This is Charles Grove, who's I'm working with in the Ayahuasca study, and Alicia Danforth. This is Harvard UCLA, where they're doing this type of research. And this is where I first found out they're opening up, the government was allowing this kind of research again, and for this particular study, pilot study of psilocybin treatment for anxiety in patients with advanced stage cancer. I'm not going to go too much into this, but just as briefly, this is the first study of its kind in several decades that was allowed. A very small sample, but they got pretty tremendous results. And I highly recommend going on YouTube and watching some of the participants talk about their experiences. One person in particular was a high-powered attorney who had severe anxiety, which she surpassed. She had a 6-month prognosis to live, and when she passed that, the anxiety got worse because, how long are we going to live, and making plans for the future, just paralyzing anxiety. Then she found out about this trial, and to hear her talk about her results is just pretty remarkable. She was able to be more in the present moment, enjoy the time she had left with her husband, and just really beautiful story. And they followed this up with 2 other studies, one at Johns Hopkins and one at the New York University. You can look those up on hepter.org to see those results. Pretty fascinating stuff. And you can also see participants talk about this. I saw some participants at the Horizons conference in New York give their testimonials, and it's just amazing stuff. And you can see more of this in the popular press, CNN, Fox News, all places, magazines. So Johns Hopkins, this is Roland Griffiths, who's doing some fascinating research with psilocybin. This is just real briefly. I mean, if you're interested in this kind of research, just look up Roland Griffiths, and he's done some pretty amazing stuff. But this is just one example of something he found. In fact, let me go for this other one first. This one's called Psilocybin Occasioned Mystical Type Experiences, Immediate and Persistent Dose-Related Effects. So you don't need to be able to read this, but they gave escalating doses to see is there a dose-related effect. And you can see at the higher doses, what he found was that the higher doses, it pretty reliably would trigger these mystical experiences in people. And there actually, there's 6 criteria that need to be met to see if someone had a mystical experience, which is a unitive experience, feeling connection with everything, a sense of awe, reverence. I'm not going to go through all of those, but and the participants were asked about this, their experience 1 month after session and 14 months. And as you can see, at the higher doses, 44% said it was the single most meaningful experience of their life. And at the 14-month follow-up, roughly about almost 40% still said that. So it seemed to be not just a flash in the pan. There was something that had some, at least up to the 14-month follow-up period, it seemed to last. And up to 94% after 14 months said it was among the top 5 most meaningful experiences, including the most single. And they asked them about that. I go, what do you mean by the most meaningful experience? I said, well, it's on the same level of significance as the death of a spouse, the birth of a first child, or something along that. So it's pretty significant. And this is just another one they found. So he found that it's not just the mushrooms itself, but it's the mystical experience that it was also seemed to have some sort of curative effect or therapeutic effect. So for this one, which is I found particularly interesting in my research, my background in psychology was affecting a personality variable. Personality is said to be pretty stable by the time you're 20 or 30. It doesn't change too much over time. If you're introverted, you can become more extroverted over time, but it's pretty much it's a stable construct. But they found that people who had a complete mystical experience had a significant increase in one of the variables called openness to experience. And this typically, you think of people getting older, become more set in their ways, and this might become more set. But so this was kind of an exciting finding to see that not many things can affect personality variables to this.
Do you find that it's mainly natural plant medicines that cause mystical experiences, or are there pharmaceuticals that do that as well?
Which sort of pharmaceuticals are you talking about?
I just mean like artificial, synthetic.
Synthetic derivatives.
Yeah.
I haven't seen research on that, but I know with LSD and these different compounds, certain of them can produce mystical experiences. So I'd like to see research showing more of this kind of thing, because this is, I think, pretty intriguing. Okay. And just a shout out to the New York School of Medicine, who's also doing some fascinating research with psilocybin. One of my interests is in depression, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with the ayahuasca research. This shows effect sizes for different approaches to treatment of depression. 0.8 seems to be like the cutoff point where you say, well, this is a pretty decent effect size, and that's the line here. So you see, doing nothing, not very effective for depression. I mean, sometimes it spontaneously remits, but if you do nothing, depression seems to, can have a lingering effect. Placebo effect is here. And you show therapy and medications are pretty much tied in terms of effect sizes. But then you see psilocybin treatment. The 2-week and 3-month follow-up, quite a bit higher. So it's very promising research in terms of treatment for depression. And that seems to be a common thing with a lot of these different compounds. There seem to be indications that they might be effective treatments for depression, which is really a call out for more research in this area.
Are those therapies and specified, because that's pretty general, right? I mean, there's therapies that have strong evidence and some that don't. Same thing for medication.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's all therapies or if it's cognitive behavioral or what.
Because if it's average across all therapies, then it could really dampen it, right?
It could. I think it probably is. But so if you did single out cognitive behavioral versus those or some of the other ones.
Several effective.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is kind of just an indication of what do psychedelics do? Why might they have these effects? And one idea is that it's the ego disintegration or ego in the sense of oneness. Again, that there's that sense of a mystical effect or mysticism. It's getting out of the ego, especially with depression. A lot of depression seems to be persons is stuck in their own self-referential thought, and a lot of that can be negative. And just a relief to come out of that thought prison seems to be an idea of why these things might work. And there's a lot of interesting evidence showing coming out of brain imaging and so forth, which I'm not going to go into in the interest of time, but pretty fascinating stuff. There's a lot of talk about the default mode network, which are certain hubs in the brain that I think people talk about that might be implicated with a sense of an ego or self-referential thought. And these psychedelics, especially the research with psilocybin, shows that these areas are damper during these experiences. I'm not going to go too much into that. There's time at the end that I can go back to that. And there's evidence showing that the higher psychedelic dose, the more ego dissolution, the more mystical experience. So I think it's just compelling, kind of interesting. And this is just a little bit more on that. So psychedelics in general, evidence showing that it increases cognitive flexibility and increased learning, increased plasticity or neural connections in the brain, increasing creative thinking, increased imaginative suggestibility, emotional lability, increased mood versus serotonin receptor 2AR, increased optimism and decreased pessimism. And this is kind of important because, as you may or may not know, rates of depression and anxiety are increasing. This is from the World Health Organization statistics. Common mental disorders are increasing worldwide between 1990 and 2013, relatively short amount of time. The number of people suffering from depression and or anxiety increased by nearly 50%, from 416 million to 615 million. Close to 10% of the world's population is affected, and mental disorders account for 30% of the global non-fatal disease burden. And so it's an increasing trend. Depression is the number one cause of absenteeism in the workplace. So there's a big financial burden on this as well, let alone the psychological, spiritual toll on people. 15% of patients with depression commit suicide. Many patients, up to 50% in some studies, show that do not respond to antidepressants, and 20% don't respond to any treatment.
Do you have any idea why depression is increasing in the world?
I could throw out ideas on it.
Let's hear them.
Well, I mean, they're showing in like Japan, Canada, United States. It's increasing a lot higher than the lowest were found in Africa, for instance. So I think moving modern life. I think just modern life. We have a lot of great things with technology and everything, but I think there's a sense of isolation, disconnection from people, disconnection from life, and the oneness of
Spike around this election, right?
yeah. Let's see what happens after the election too. Thank you. So now switching to ayahuasca. So I'm not going to go too much into past research on this, but there's a lot of very promising research in terms of addictions, addiction treatment. I just saw a documentary recently on Takalasi in Peru. It's a 9-month program, but they're showing very, very wonderful cure rates in terms of opiate addiction using ayahuasca. And compared to what treatment here, conventional treatment, much higher rates of lower recidivism rates and so forth. So I'm just going to briefly discuss one of these, a couple of these. The Ayahuasca project was in 1993. This involved Charles Grove and Dennis McKenna. And they were invited to go down to Brazil, study with the Santo Daime Church, and study people who have been taking this long term. So these people have been taken at least for 10 years, 2 ceremonies on average per month. And the salient findings were they want to see what is there a toxicity effect? Is this bad on your body over time? And the short answer is no. It's very safe on the body for the most part. Salient findings including remission of psychopathology following the initiation of ayahuasca, which that's what the term for ayahuasca in the church. Use along with no evidence of personality or cognitive deterioration. In fact, they actually improved on certain cognitive tasks. And overall assessment revealed high functioning status, which is good news. Later studies of users from 2 Brazilian churches, the UBV and Santo Daime, continue to show remission in alcohol and substance abuse problems, as well as positive and neutral effects on personality and cognition. And there's a lot of papers that came out of this, so I'm not going to go into, but very, very promising findings. And this is just a most recent finding that I thought was kind of interesting. This year, 2016, antidepressant effects of a single dose of ayahuasca in patients with recurring depression. And they found that ayahuasca administration was associated with fast-acting antidepressant effects in 6 depressive patients, starting as early as 80 minutes, and they followed them up to 21 days. And it's a shame they didn't follow them past 21 days, and I'm not sure why, but in our study we did follow them for longer than that. Share that information now. So first of all, what is ayahuasca? I'm assuming most of you know what it is, but I'm going to just give a really quick rundown of it. Ayahuasca is a decoction of 2 plants in the Amazon. One of them is chacruna plant, or Psychotrichum viridis. And it's a plant that's plentiful down there. It has high concentrations of DMT. The problem with DMT, though, in this form is if you eat it, your gut breaks it down before it can cross the blood-brain barrier, so it's not orally active. So it needs another component, which is an natural occurring MAO inhibitor, which is the vine, which is also referred to as ayahuasca, but it's a Banisteris coffee plant. And so what they do is they mash up this vine, they combine it with the leaves, they boil it in water for several hours until it becomes condensed into this foul-tasting tea. And I don't know if any of you have ever tasted it, but it's usually not the most pleasant-tasting thing. And it can be nobody wants to take it, oh, are you kidding? Okay, so I'm going to skip real quickly to okay. So growing body of evidence showing that ayahuasca may help alleviate certain psychiatric problems, depression, addictions, PTSD. But as I said, longitudinal data is sparse. And to date, no studies can be found that examine changes in existential values. And lastly, ayahuasca is legal in Peru and is considered part of the national heritage, which is the reason why we decided to do the research there instead of trying to get approval here, which would have taken a lot of time. So we studied 52 participants. These are people who went down already for a 10-day ayahuasca retreat, which included 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. So it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday were the ceremonies. We used the SAL-90, which is a psychiatric measure measuring 9 different dimensions of psychiatric distress, including depression, anxiety, hostility, and so forth. And the LAP-R, which was the existential measure based on the work of Viktor Frankl. This is the, I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. The setting was the Sacred Valley in Peru. It was not done at Machu Picchu, but just one brief thing about this was that this was not a setting in the hospital where everything was tightly controlled. This was a group of people who went down for this retreat. So we had a bonding experience. We went to these great places. People could argue that that itself was kind of curative. So there's very little control over certain of these things. More pictures from Peru. If you've never been there, put it on your bucket list if you're interested in that kind of thing, because it's awesome experience. I'll talk about the measures themselves as I go over the results in the interest of time. The LAP-R was based on the work of Viktor Frankl, whom you probably know was interned in a concentration camp during World War II, and he found out that people who survived tend to have a stronger sense of meaning and purpose. So they developed a questionnaire based on his ideas. We asked a lot of different questions, number of times taken ayahuasca or psychedelics, what sort of medical issues you want to address, psychological issues, and we're still analyzing these data. So, how intense was the experience? We asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense was this? Average was about 8. So this is something you don't want to take lightly. You want to do your research before you do it because it's not a walk in the park. The range is 1 to 10. I can't imagine people saying 1, but how scary was the experience? Average about 5. You know, some people had said 10. So it can be a very scary experience. You could have you're dealing with shadow material coming up, or just a lot of different things. So, but again, those can be very healing themselves, and a lot of people say that even though it's scary and intense, that they got a lot out of it. So go ahead, your goals met, average of about 8. So this is the bread and butter of the results. This is so going from left to right, this is a pre-test. This is after 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. This is at the 3-month follow-up and at the 6-month follow-up. And as you can see, there's kind of a nice progression, a downward progression for the most part. And so this is depression, which was probably one of the most dramatic and interesting findings. Although some of these other ones, interpersonal sensitivity and so forth, were also dramatic. But so pre and post test, you get a significant drop in depression. And you're hoping that, well, is this a flash in the pan, or is this something that lasts longer, is going to hold? And sure enough, at the 3-month follow-up, there was even more of a drop, and at 6 months it held, it even dropped a little more. So obviously, this isn't just the components of the medicine, the chemicals working. There's something else going on which deserves more research to follow up with. Some of these other ones, this is somatic complaints, headaches. These are bodily manifestations of distress. OCD symptoms, obsessive compulsive disorder. Interpersonal sensitivity, that's being overly sensitive to people's criticism and so forth. Depression, anxiety, hostility, phobic anxiety, paranoid ideation, psychosis or psychotic items, and these are additional items. This is just showing the pre-test and the 6-month follow-up, just to show the overall gains. And you can see like dramatic drops in depression in a lot of these. going in the right direction. This is the Global Symptom Index, which is kind of adding them all together for a general measure of distress, pretty much similar drop. These are the existential measures, and a little disappointing that these weren't a little more dramatic, but they're all going in the right direction. Sense of purpose, sense of cohesion, like your life makes sense. Death acceptance, which includes a lessening fear of death. Existential vacuum, feeling of emptiness, and so forth, and goal seeking. And these, again, they're not huge, dramatic, or most of those aren't significant, but they're going the right direction. And the death acceptance was kind of the most interesting to me, because what kind of things do you know that can make that kind of change? And these are the composite measures. Existential transcendence takes them all into consideration for just kind of like a global measure of their existential changes. And you see there it's going in the right direction, and get a nice little increase there. There's some negative experiences, which should be understated. So some people said that they had a terrible experience afterwards, and I was kind of a little concerned about them. And so, but the good news is, I don't have time to read all this, but this is the Global Symptom Index. So it shows that although people from post afterwards did have reported increase in the distress, but the good news is that the follow-up, they tended to remit. They tended to go down. They tended to integrate their experience and recover from whatever they went through. And this person, even though there was a little blip up, there was still a net improvement in terms of their symptoms. This is another one even more dramatic. This person just had was doing pretty well at the beginning, just skyrocketed up. But then, at the 3-month follow-up, we back down to baseline and maintained. I was kind of curious to see what might account for this, and it seems like people who are naive or had never taken any psychedelic or had never taken ayahuasca before were more likely to have these negative experiences. And I kind of likened it to surfing, like, if you're not used to surfing, you're going to wipe out a lot, and but the more you do it, the more you're able to navigate these altered states. Now, I didn't want to leave this just on a negative note. These are some of the positive things people said. So they gained spiritual clarity, more appreciation for life. They gained the foundations for this life. We're all one. Great insights about life. Respect for the plant, self-knowledge, and awareness. We're doing a content analysis on this right now. We're having people rate these, and one of the judges is here right now. So hopefully I can present that some other time, and that will be published. So I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to go to the summary. So many measures of psychiatric distress went down significantly after 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. These gains were not only retained over time, they were increased up to at least 6 months. Depression scores went down by 43% by the 6-month mark, which I think is very exciting. Existential measures showed trends in the expected directions, and existential transcendence increased significantly. Negative experiences tend to remit over time, which is important to note, because a lot of people do have negative experiences. Not a lot, but a fair percentage have negative experiences where they come out not feeling like a daisy, right? But the good thing is, like,
what's the rough percentage?
It depends on how many. I would say for this, maybe out of 18, 5 said they had a negative experience. And when I say negative, like one person said they got pretty much nothing out of it. He came with a severe neurodegenerative disease, and I think he was experimentally cured. He pretty much said it was a bust. Some people just had very scary experiences, and they weren't sure like what happened. They just seemed kind of disoriented, but they were able to integrate it. I haven't seen stats on that, but that's an interesting question. Concluding thoughts, this is a very small n, no control group, no random assignment. So obviously this isn't the best scientifically controlled experiment, but still I think it's compelling results. On the other end of the spectrum, Jordi Riva is doing interesting stuff in Barcelona, Spain, where they They freeze-dry the ayahuasca, they measure the concentration of it, so they administer it. It's in a sterile hospital setting. There's no Icaros, no shaman songs, which they think is awesome. There was, interestingly enough, there's no purging, which people think you purge a lot of the toxins out, a lot of negative energy, purge out traumas and so forth. And still, he's finding interesting results. Ayahuasca may have the potential as a treatment for certain psychiatric ailments, most notably depression. More research needs to be done on this, of course. Given significant decrease in fear of death, research with persons facing terminal illness is warranted, similar with what they were doing with mushrooms or psilocybin research. There's a need to better understand essential safety parameters. Data is still being coded and analyzed, and next step is formal clinical trials. I just want to say there's a lot of resources out there. I was just told that be careful of arrowhead.com because it's not a well-regulated site, but there is information on there in terms of some of these substances. But this is maps.org if you want to find out more about the MDMA research and things going on. And they're doing other types of research, different compounds as well. After.org is primarily psilocybin research. They did all of the 3 clinical trials with terminally ill cancer patients and use of psilocybin. Fascinating stuff. And just YouTube. You can just YouTube any of these things, and there's great documentaries on there, interviews and so forth. And just lastly, the group I started, LAMPS, if anyone's interested in signing up for that, we have a sign-up sheet here. Sister organization in LA, there's not a lot going on in LA, but the AWARE project has also a lot of great things going on. You can sign up for that as well. And this is just kind of a word map using Wordle for people, what they said about their ayahuasca experience. And the experience comes out. So it definitely is an experience. No matter what happens, you come out with feeling impacted. And some of the life perspective gained. It isn't a scientific thing, but I thought it was just kind of an interesting way to show what people were saying about this kind of stuff. And thank you.
Yay!
So we have about 8 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Are there words? I'm trying to understand. There are certain languages that you could certain words you could use to talk about this, like if selling ayahuasca extracts. Do you know if supplement is something that is a word that is permitted, or if it's?
I'm probably the best person to ask about that. I really don't know. But ayahuasca itself, the Banister coffee plant, is not illegal. So, it's in fact I've seen it sold on Amazon.com. Again, that doesn't have DMT in it, so there's no hallucinogenic properties to it. So, I can't comment on that. But yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask about the relative clinical severity of the population that you were studying down there. So did you get a sense, maybe a question, have you been diagnosed with clinical depression or some kind of metric like that to get a sense of, this kind of everyday depression, anxiety type symptoms that the great majority of the people were struggling with, or some of them at the end of or in the process of a long struggle with clinical depression?
Yeah, we did not. This was a very simple study. We didn't have funding for it, so pretty much just got permission to do these questionnaires and ask questions. Some people did. We asked them to state their intention, and some people said, well, yeah, I'm struggling with clinical depression or something like that. The SEL90, is a broad swath of psychiatric problems, so we didn't add like a depression inventory or anything like that to get clinical indication. We could kind of roughly guesstimate based on certain things, but no clinical interviews or anything like that. If we do a follow-up study to this, that would be fascinating to do. And to contrast this with the other study I showed, where they showed fast-acting effects, that was a population with recurrent depression. So there you have a higher baseline to start with, so you're going to show more dramatic drops in depression. So this was, I would guess it was a fairly high-functioning group. on the average. I know some people, I know one person personally who was struggling with clinical depression. Other than that, we did not formally diagnose these people or have like a definitive measure of that.
I just wanted to add as one of the coders for it that although we're not done with that depression was widely indicated both in the informal section where they can write it in and of course some of the self-rating stuff. So we don't have final numbers on that, but that was prominent. It is prominent.
Right, so they may indicate depression. We have no idea if it's clinical unless they measure it.
That's right, yeah.
But that was what, depression and anxiety were some of the biggest things. Social anxiety was big also. Wanted to be more comfortable around people, wanted to get along better with people. Those are kind of some common themes. You know the common theme you want to comment on, or is that?
No, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of us who survived the 60s and 70s know that psychedelics were quite popular, and there were people reported mystical and wonderful experiences, but there were also casualties.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, this is great. Thank you for the presentation. I actually went to school with Rick Alvin, but there seems to be a resurgence in interest broadly. However, I am quite concerned about corporatization of things like marijuana, the use of psychedelics in raves, just staying up all night, 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 nights in a row, really without any of the protective shield and supportive community that your group had. It seems like we're on the verge of maybe a much greater understanding of these things, but also much greater risk. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about ways. Obviously, it's a very fine line and delicate, but it seems that it needs to be addressed. And if it's not addressed by people with some understanding of it, then it will be addressed, like it was in the past, by Nixon's darker shadow, if you will, and people like that.
It's an excellent point, and as you probably might be aware of places like Burning Man, they actually started the Zendo project where they are addressing these concerns because unsupervised use of this, I'm only advocating under controlled circumstances and in a safe setting for this, but obviously that's, it's been done everywhere. Huge dangers with, getting stuff on the street, you don't know what it is. And, you see a lot of casualties, especially at places like Burning Man and stuff, because you don't know what you're getting. People don't know what they're doing. They don't know the proper dose. They don't do the research with it. Even with stuff like this, we have people showing up not doing the research of what ayahuasca was. We had one person show up still on Prozac, even though they were, and it's one thing I was stressing, limited amount of time, so I don't have time to stress the dangers and the contraindications, but you can't take this stuff on Prozac or SSRIs, and there's certain things you need to know before you take this, and so education is a huge, huge component. Harm reduction is big right now in the community. The AWARE project is doing great strides in terms of educating people, LAMPS also. Trying to get the word out there in terms of safe use of this if you're going to use it illegally or outside of supervision. So it's an excellent point, and that's one thing we don't want a recurrence of what happened in the 60s where there's tons of casualties and the government steps in and shuts down legitimate research and so forth. So yeah, I don't know if that completely addressed it.
It's helpful. Thank you.
You have time for one question.
Can you just talk a little bit about what you think the difference is, or if there is a difference between the results based on the experience had and effects on the brain?
Experiences had?
Like the mystical experience versus what the chemicals are actually doing to
That's a fascinating point, and I think that's one reason why I wanted to show that one thing with the openness thing, because and one thing I didn't show was, I hope this kind of answers the question, but they also did one on smoking cessation, and they found that they give high doses of psilocybin, but they found that only the people that had the mystical experiences had this. I think 80% of them were smoke-free at 6 months out. And the people who didn't have the mystical experiences didn't have that effect. So it's hard to say, you know. But then on the other hand, I have heard anecdotal evidence, at least people microdosing with mushrooms, and quitting smoking also. So obviously they didn't have a mystical experience, but then maybe there's some chemical component. Maybe it's all placebo, who knows? There needs to be clinical trials with this kind of thing. So it's really hard to tease that out. But there's a lot of evidence showing that the mystical experience itself is extremely powerful for a lot of people. You know, end-stage life, you know, cancer patients, you know, smoking cessation, you know, personality changes. But the chemical itself, like ayahuasca itself has a lot of alkaloids. Ibogaine has a lot of alkaloids. So they're doing something, but it's just, it needs a lot more research to tease those out. And it's just, right now it's kind of a gray area, but that's kind of my take on it. So thank you very much. I can see that. Anyone else sign up for LAMPS? I have a sign up sheet here.